So tonight I'm titling my talk, Blessed Michael McGivney, Patron of Catholic Social Teaching. So that's the theme for tonight, okay? All right, well, where I want to start with is Blessed Michael McGivney's context. Because the Knights of Columbus were founded for more than dressing up in special uniforms and assisting with parking at St. Paul's during games, okay? The Knights were founded by Blessed Michael McGivney, and his life and work cannot be understood without grasping the American situation during which he lived and worked as a priest. That McGivney chose to form the Knights as a mutual aid society and insurance organization has a context. And that context has two relevant facets, namely the social status of Catholics in the United States during the 19th century and the resulting temptations towards joining secret societies as a means to alleviate the consequence of their status. So starting with the first thing that I mentioned, Catholics in the United States during the 19th century generally belonged to the working class and also immigrant population that was kind of at the mercy of the surrounding Protestant population that had control of most of the social institutions. And this tension was exacerbated by so-called nativism that dominated during the mid-19th century. As waves of German and Irish Catholics flooded into the United States seeking a better life, the dominant culture understandably felt threatened by the potential consequences for traditional forms of American life. Greatest among these fears was foreign influence from the Bishop of Rome by means of Catholics, a concern that existed from the founding of this country, in fact. The political cartoonist Thomas Nast, for instance, infamously used his talents to draw depictions of the Pope looking across the Atlantic, setting his sights on the conquest of the U.S. In company with an assembled group of clerical henchmen, right, who all look very, kind of nefarious and so forth. Or of patriotic Americans defending their families and schools from an invasion by alligators from the sea, but upon second glance are revealed to be bishops with mitres shaped like jaws. This was in the 1870s when Vatican I had proclaimed papal infallibility, and paranoia against the Church had reached a crescendo of sorts. But the greatest threats to Catholics came during the 1830s and 60s with the political successes of so-called know-nothingism. This movement waged propaganda wars against Catholic populations and stirred up riots to suppress resistance before falling apart due to internal disputes. Now, during these decades, the U.S. bishops met in a series of what were called provincial councils in the center of American Catholicism, Baltimore. The fourth of these provincial councils in 1840 is most telling, and I'm drawing this from the New Catholic Encyclopedia for this. Gregory XVI's apostolic letter condemned the slave trade in Supremo Apostolatus. It was read there. Previous conciliar decrees on matrimony, preaching, and the catechism were reiterated, and temperance societies were commended. The Protestant orientation of U.S. public schools was stressed, and Catholics were urged to assert their civil rights in this matter. Membership in secret societies was forbidden to Catholics. It touched upon the usual topics of anti-Catholicism, religious education, vocations and marriage, but also included an exhortation to conscientious exercise of the right to vote in civil elections, and sections on secret societies, intemperance, and the dangers of wealth. So we hear in this section of what we would expect from a council like this, talking about anti-Catholicism, religious education, and the threat of a U.S. public school system, which tended to be dominated by Protestant culture. Questions of marriage were also relevant in this regard due to difficulties posed by mixed marriages for the education of children in the faith. Note also the problem of alcohol abuse. It has become a commonplace to deride temperance and the resulting prohibition as a neuralgic problem just for Protestants, but in fact the Catholic hierarchy was just as concerned about what they were seeing among Catholics during the mid-19th century and were supportive of attempts at temperance movements. Excuse me a moment. Anyways, but notice another issue that finds mention twice, secret societies. Peter Gilday, in his History of the Councils of Baltimore, explains in more detail. The seventh decree concerned the rule of the Church against Catholics joining secret societies, and warned the faithful that the sacraments would be denied to those who disobeyed this injunction. No specific societies were mentioned in the decree, but it was understood that the Freemasons and Oddfellows were primarily under the ban. Now, we may not care too much about these sorts of societies today, but at the time of the American Catholic Church, in that era, was rightly concerned with their influence. It was not merely about the historic conflict between Roman Catholicism and European Masonry. Anglo-American Masonry was a different beast entirely from that tradition. The primary concern amongst the bishops seems to have been the inculcation of attitudes deleterious to the Catholic faith, whether it be religious indifferentism, naturalistic religious beliefs and practices, and also the binding of Catholic consciences to anti-clerical allegiances. Well, then we have to ask, why would a Catholic ever consider joining such an organization if this was the case? Well, for the obvious social benefits that accrued from belonging to a tight-knit network of fellow workers. Fraternal organizations in the U.S. have a well-known history of being means for social advancement among members, and secrecy surrounding initiatory rites and beliefs accentuate the feelings of belonging. More practically, however, were the economic benefits. Many of these groups by the late 19th century were providing access to mutual aid, especially in the form of insurance. Remember that this is a period of time when labor unions had yet to reach the power they would have during the early 20th century, and a widespread government safety net in the form of Social Security and similar programs had not yet been instituted. If a working man, usually, was injured or died, his family could become easily destitute. Thus, the temptations to join a secret society as a hedge against disaster could require heroic virtue for many lower-class Catholics to resist. Well then, enter Blessed Michael McGivney. He did not live long, only from 1852 to 1890, but his work remains impactful to this very day because of how he responded to the challenges spoken of above. Ordained in 1877, his most famous assignment was to St. Mary's Church in New Haven, Connecticut, which I had previously mentioned, a church I had the privilege of visiting in June during my service to a monastery of our nuns in the area. While assigned there, he observed the struggles of poor Catholics and the temptations towards secret societies, in particular amongst the young, who were probably looking for social advancement during the time. But rather than condemning his flock for their weakness of wills, he decided to do something about it. He founded the Knights of Columbus as a humble, local fraternal organization, and the idea was not original to McGivney, as I learned during my visit to the Knights of Columbus Museum, but rather he researched similar projects in New York and elsewhere as he discerned how to minister to his New England flock. But rather than founding a subsidiary of a pre-existing benefit society, McGivney decided upon forming a fraternal insurance society with an exceptional emphasis on the fittingness of Roman Catholicism as a patriotic contributor to American politics and society. That was his unique contribution here. And he did so through his trademark patronage of the explorer Christopher Columbus, reminding his Protestant co-citizens that the Americas were discovered by a Catholic. It was an assertion of religious legitimacy in the face of hostility, meeting the challenge of the Mayflower heritage with the century earlier, mind you, heritage of the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria. Members of the Knights of Columbus were enrolled in the insurance program and then later as non-insured associates as well, kind of joined as also. Prayer and patriotism were cultivated, secret rites and special clothing were instituted, and so on. All the trappings of secret societies, but now converted to Catholic usage very creatively. The Knights of Columbus also gradually went on the offensive, engaging in anti-defamation activities against their nativist critics. It has only expanded since these early days to engage a variety of civic and patriotic activities, from founding of institutions to support of active military service members. Funding of education, of course, has also been naturally a priority given the importance of Catholic education today. And so, therefore, I would like to present Blessed Michael McGivney, who has had that status of blessed since 2020, as a patron of Catholic social doctrine. Now, what is this social doctrine that I speak of? Well, it's the outgrowth of the Church's meditation over the centuries on the nature of justice and peace in society, and the demand of God to seek such, not only as a consequence of Christian charity, but of the natural justice for which all peoples have been divinely designed without exception. It is not a Catholic political ideology, but a subfield of moral theology, which is why I like it. It deals with man's social life and with the social institutions and structures man requires to live that life, quote unquote. It is Catholic social doctrine, in fact, that played a dominant role in my return to the practice of the Catholic faith, and so I've got a special place for it in my heart. And it remains a primary subject of interest in my studies as a moral theologian, but that's a story for another time. Now, the acceptance of Catholic social doctrine follows upon acceptance of the Church's claim to teach authoritatively in the realm of natural ethics, a claim repeatedly argued by popes since the founding document of modern Catholic social teaching, Rerum Novarum, in 1891. Pius XI, in the second major document, Quadragesimo Anno, in 1931, put it this way: "There resides in us," that is, the pontifical tradition, "the right and duty to pronounce with supreme authority upon social and economic matters. Certainly the Church was not given the commission to guide men to an only fleeting and perishable happiness, but to that which is eternal. But she can in no wise renounce the duty God entrusted to her to interpose her authority in all things that are connected with the moral law. Even though economics and moral science employs each its own principles in its own sphere, it is nevertheless an error to say that the economic and moral orders are so distinct from and alien to each other that the former depends in no way on the latter. It is reason itself that clearly shows the purpose which God ordained for all economic life. But it is only the moral law which commands us to seek directly in each kind of activity those purposes which we know that nature, or rather God, the author of nature, established for that kind of action, and in orderly relationship to subordinate such immediate subordinate such immediate purposes to our supreme and last end." What is he saying there? In other words, because God the Redeemer and God the Sanctifier cannot be separated from God the Creator, and the moral law is embedded in creation itself, not something merely derived from divine command, the Church has not only the authority but the duty to teach in matters of social ethics insofar as they concern the human nature taken up by Christ himself in the Incarnation. This flies in the face of all claims to moral neutrality in the realm of political economy. Economics is first of all a moral science, then a technical one, and the same is true of politics in general. Now, a full exposition of Catholic social doctrine is beyond the scope of my talk, of course, but a sufficient overview can be found in the Compendium on the Social Doctrine of the Church, published in 2003 by the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace under the pontificate of St. John Paul II. So I'll draw upon that. The compendium points to 4 key principles that underlie everything the Church has to say about social ethics today: the dignity of the human person, the common good, subsidiarity, and solidarity. Now, the first is the basis for the last 3, which makes clear that all facets of social ethics are primarily oriented towards protecting and promoting human dignity. And yet, as Russell Hittinger points out in a 2009 paper, the last 3 are also irreducibly social. He says, "The dignity of the human person cannot be interpreted on the premise of methodological individualism, namely that social unities and relations among members can be reduced to non-social properties of members or composites thereof." What does he mean by this? Well, he's pointing to social contract theories of society, and this is the contrast, right? Social contract theories of society rely upon fictitious sorts of accounts of history to justify the existence of the state, which is an idea utterly contrary to Christian anthropology. For, as we know from Genesis, it is not good that man should be alone, but he is designed for society. It's not something that has to be worked out in a contract. It's by nature we're meant to live together. Okay, so the first one, the first principle, human dignity, is not difficult to understand for Christians, for whom being made in the image and likeness of God is a commonplace. The other principles are more or less well known and should be clarified to grasp their meaning. Common good, for instance, is actually the most difficult to define sometimes. It is not, as the compendium says, the simple sum of particular goods of each subject of a social entity. Okay, so it's not just the collective goods of a community, but rather they relate it to the body politic in the same way that the individual good is related to individual persons. So here's a quote from that section in the compendium. "The common good indicates the sum total of social conditions, which allow people either as groups or as individuals to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. Just as the moral actions of an individual are accomplished in doing what is good, so too the actions of a society attain their full stature when they bring about the common good. It can be understood as the social and community dimension of the moral good." In other words, the common good is a condition of society, whereby parts and whole are reciprocally bound up in the same thriving. A virtuous society is one in which the good is maximally easy and enjoyable at every level of organization, in the same way that virtuous activity arises from a human being having holistically good character. My favorite analogy for this is what popes since John Paul II have spoke of as human ecology. It's a great metaphor. Just as a thriving environment can be characterized by a certain balanced diversity amongst the life forms that it hosts, so too can a human society be characterized by the mutually beneficial interplay of activities amongst its members. Okay, so the other two principles, subsidiarity and solidarity, are best understood relative to one another. Though least well known, the principle of subsidiarity actually is the earliest to be expounded in Catholic social doctrine, perhaps due to the immediate threats of the late 19th century industrialism and the political movements it inspired afterwards, such as communism, for instance. In essence, subsidiarity demands respect for the myriad of mediating institutions found within a healthy society. Quote, family, groups, associations, local territorial realities, in short, for that aggregate of economic, social, cultural, sports-oriented, recreational, professional, and political expressions to which people spontaneously give life and which make it possible for them to achieve effective social growth. Without these, above all the family, society is reduced to man versus state and the war of all against all. That is its outcome, contrary to Thomas Hobbes, who thought that way of organizing society was supposed to get rid of these things. Against this, the principle of subsidiarity holds, I quote, just as it is gravely wrong to take from individuals what they can accomplish by their own initiative and industry and give it to the community, so also it is an injustice and at the same time a grave evil and disturbance of right order to assign to a greater and higher association what lesser and subordinate organizations can do. For every social activity ought of its very nature to furnish help to the members of the body social and never destroy and absorb them. In other words, don't give a task to a higher level of organization that a lower level can take care of. When implemented, subsidiarity provides a downward pressure on political and economic power, distributing it as low as possible, that is, insofar as it can be achieved at a lower level, and presenting an obstacle to consolidation and centralization. It is the least well-implemented principle in human history. We have a sinful knack for handing over our dignity for the sake of expedience to people who are more powerful than us. However, the federalism of the United States was actually intended to implement a form of subsidiarity, but of course citizens of every age have found such intolerable for their own pet projects. Okay, yet we as Catholics also believe in solidarity. The principle is a consequence of our interconnectedness, demanding that when a lower level of organization cannot sufficiently accomplish the goods needed for human thriving, then a higher level of organization may be called upon to provide the organization necessary. An easily graspable example of this is the court system of the United States. If a decision is not appropriate for a lower court, a higher court must provide. Much debate can be had over when and how solidarity should be exercised, of course, but one cannot, as a Catholic, deny, in principle, the need for centralization of power and authority in particular cases. Thus, solidarity provides an upward pressure on political and economic power, relinquishing the activities of a given institution at a lower level to a higher one for the sake of the common good. And how we're meant to implement all of these is just the interplay of debate and decision-making. This is just how it works in human society. Now, all of this may seem esoteric in relation to our subject, Blessed Michael McGivney, but it actually has a point. McGivney, prior to the foundation of modern Catholic social teaching, found himself implementing exactly what is required during his own time based on those principles, whether elaborated or not. The Knights of Columbus fulfilled a local need that gradually expanded its operations to fulfill that need throughout the country and beyond, globally. It responded to a need to shore up the human dignity of Catholic citizens of the United States. Rather than look to higher levels of organization, for instance, civil governing institutions, the Knights of Columbus became the lower level institution to provide, in a limited way, the necessary supports. That is, it did not attempt to fulfill every need, but the needs at hand for the local community. And in doing so, it promoted not only the common good of the church's members, but also of the rest of society as well. For example, women and children not being destitute after the death of a working father, prevented myriad social ills from occurring in the future, and so on. This is not to say that these functions cannot be provided for by civil governing institutions, but it does demand questions about who is best positioned to actually meet those needs. The Church's demand is the lowest you can go, and that was the Knights of Columbus at the time. They were the closest to the issues at hand. So the lessons should be plain for us today, but let me make them explicit. In my opinion, for too long we've had a tendency of outsourcing our Catholic solidarity to surrounding secular society. And as a result, we continue to live in a world where church is thought of as a lifestyle accessory rather than the center of our Christian life. We are living in a time where new solutions are needed for Catholics to thrive in an increasingly hostile world. And what I mean by that is one which militates against virtue and powerfully encourages vice. This was Blessed Michael McGivney's context that he had to deal with during his own time. And what did he do with it? He looked at already existing models of activity, adapted it for Catholics, and got it started at a local level. So the questions for you then are, what models already exist for solving issues that Catholics are confronted with today? Can these models be co-opted and used for the sake of the gospel? How do we avoid anachronism and superficiality in all of this, of course? We can't just recreate the stuff from the past. Now, as examples of what's being done today, consider focused missionary work or Bishop Barron's Word on Fire, right? These are all people who are using things that other people invented and did great things with it. I can think of other examples for discussion doing Q&A, but let's wait on that. Okay, in conclusion, we should look to Blessed Michael McGivney's context, life, and work as a model for how we can implement Catholic social doctrine today. And this makes him an apt patron of Catholic social doctrine, now and into the future, once he, God willing, is canonized as a saint. Pope Leo XIV himself gave a short address via social media on August 13th, pointing to Blessed Michael McGivney as a sign of hope as we point others to the gospel. Quote, "He saw the many needs of immigrant Catholics and sought to bring relief to the poor and suffering through his faithful celebration of the sacraments, as well as through fraternal assistance, which continues on to this day. The sacraments are the source and summit of our faith, empowering our activities in the world, but also requiring the offering back of the fruits of our labors to the Lord through our worship. Blessed Michael McGivney, please pray for us, that we may approach the social issues we face today with the same hope, determination, and creativity with which God has graced you. Amen." Thank you.